Could you explain a little bit about this concept of the interlife?
Yeah. Well, actually, to be fair, it was a fairly heavy component in the original Book of the Soul, because what had happened is I came across, when I was adding this extra chapter into Genesis Unveiled, and when asked by Virgin, I came across the work of this chap, Michael Newton, who many of the people listening to this may well have heard of. He's an American psychiatrist who, for many years, was taking his clients not just into past lives, but into their time between lives, in the spirit realms, light realms, whatever you want to call them. And his findings of what his subjects were doing in this time, this sort of interlife period, as I call it, were really quite astounding. And his books are sold in hundreds of thousands. So, many, many people have now been exposed to these ideas, which is wonderful. But what I discovered was that back in the late 60s and 70s and early 80s, there were a number of pioneers who had done this work and taken their clients into the interlife, and they were nearly all qualified psychiatrists or psychologists who had originally been of a more materialist or atheist persuasion and just got persuaded by the work that they were doing and the evidence before their eyes. Nearly all of them stumbled across this interlife experience with their subjects almost completely by accident, just by initiating slightly imprecise commands while the subjects were in trance. And most important of all, they basically were all coming up with a very consistent set of experiences in the interlife, which include, very briefly, I tend to summarize them into 5, which is the sort of transition into the spirit realms and the healing process, so that you can sort of raise the vibrations to properly be in the light realms. The second one is some sort of review of the life that you've just had. The third one is quite often some sort of experience of being with other souls that you're quite closely associated with. Some people call them a soul group or a set of soul mates, and sort of doing sort of review and learning activities with them. The fourth one is, and perhaps the most important and the one with the most implications of the lot, is the idea of next life planning. In other words, that we as souls plan the next life we're going to have. We're actively involved in planning and choosing the challenges we're going to face so that we can grow and learn as a soul. And the fifth one is the whole element of returning back into the physical. So those 5 elements were basically present in the work of all of these pioneers, and they had this was the 60s, 70s and 80s. There was no internet then. They were all working independently. They weren't publishing the results of their research, or the few that didn't get around to doing it till the sort of mid-80s. So this original research was all being done independently, and yet they were all coming up with the same information. And I think there are very strong arguments that the independence and the objectivity of that original research mean that this interlife evidence, as I call it, is very, very strong evidence in support of rational spirituality as well. Most people know about it, and an awful lot of spiritual people know about this interlife experience now and have read about it because of the popularity of Michael Newton's books, which first came out in the mid-90s. But back in the day when this pioneering work was being done, people didn't know about it very much. So I think it was really, really good evidence. And it tells us an awful lot about how we should interpret what sort of framework we should put on this idea of reincarnation and what it all means, basically.
Also, you say about the notion of the holographic soul. Could you explain a little bit about that, please?
Yeah, well, that was an idea that I first came up with in that second spiritual book, The Wisdom of the Soul. And really, the reason I came up with it was because for some time I'd been sort of trying to grapple with this idea that clearly the evidence I was talking about within rational spirituality was very much indicating that we are individual souls that reincarnate and have many lives in order to experience various different things and to grow from one life to the next and grow as a soul. And then at some point this process is complete, and we don't really, we've taken everything we can from the physical plane, or at least Earth, and we go on and have other experience in other planes or dimensions or whatever, and continue the growth process. So that came very strongly out from all the different elements of evidence that I'd been putting together for rational spirituality. But of course I was also very much aware that if you like, the slightly more Buddhist viewpoint on things is, using the word very loosely, is that we are all part of the one or the all or the source, whatever you want to call it. which is also clearly true. I mean, it's supported by so many different things. People having hallucinogenic experiences and just proper transcendental experiences when meditating in all sorts of different ways. And also, I guess there are elements of modern science now which very much support the view as well, that we are just all interconnected and all part of one basic energy. So, and of course, what I felt was that an awful lot of spiritual people tend to sort of really emphasize one or the other of these approaches. They either concentrate very much on the idea of us as individual souls, but maybe think rather less about the idea that we're all part of the one. Whereas, on the other hand, certainly people, and again I use the word very loosely, but people who tend to be of a more Buddhist type persuasion, do tend to go much more down this route of we're all part of the one, or the all, or source. And in fact, a lot of strains of Buddhism, a lot of people don't realize this, do not really support the idea of individual soul reincarnation at all. They have a concept called anatta, which really is much more about having no self, is what it means, in loosely translated. So there isn't really this continuity in Buddhism, in a lot of strains of Buddhism, this idea of a continuity of one soul identity moving from one life to the next. Now, I think that, personally, that's wrong. I think the evidence supports the idea that there is very much this individual soul continuity, but clearly we are all part of Source as well. And now I'm not suggesting for a moment that there aren't lots of spiritual sources who have tried to get to grips with this idea of us being both individual and universal soul consciousnesses all at the same time. But the thing that I tried to bring to the party was that if you apply the idea of the hologram since its discovery back in the mid-20th century has been applied to all sorts of different things, and it's certainly been applied in spiritual scientific circles a lot. But I never felt it had quite been applied in the right way. To me, if you apply the idea of the hologram to soul consciousness itself, that's when you end up with the most wonderful way of trying to get to grips with how individual and universal soul consciousness work. Because what I say is, that soul consciousness is holographic. In other words, we are both individual aspects of Source and full holographic representations of Source all at the same time. But this doesn't mean that the idea of soul individuality is in itself an illusion, because one of the key principles of the hologram is that the part contains the whole, but is clearly distinguishable from it. And I go into this in more detail. It's actually not very complicated, and I have diagrams in one of my more recent books, a little book that I call Your Holographic Soul, and how to make it work for you. There's a nice little explanation there with a diagram of exactly what I'm getting at here in terms of the principle of the hologram and how the photographic plate of a hologram works and that sort of thing. But a lot of people have found it's a very useful way of using this idea of the hologram to actually get to grips with how the interplay between individual and universal soul consciousness works for all of us, because we are all both.
I noticed that about a couple of years ago you brought out a short version of the Book of the Soul called the Little Book of the Soul,
yeah,
and a longer version called the Big Book of the Soul. What was the thinking behind this?
Yeah, well, the Big Book of the Soul is a complete rewrite of the original Book of the Soul, but having already, I wanted to write the Little Book of the Soul as a very simple introduction to all of these things, because the Big Book of the Soul, as it now is a reasonably lengthy and detailed piece of work with quite a lot of sort of relatively scholarly stuff in it, which is not for everybody. So I wanted a nice, simple introduction, which is what the Little Book of the Soul is. It's a small, pocket-sized book, and it's nice and simple, and it has a lot of the key cases as just sort of presented in story format, really, with a little bit of analysis interspersed between them. But then, when I was doing the rewrite of the original Book of the Soul, it seemed only appropriate then to call it the Big Book of the Soul, so that the two were sort of clearly distinguished, and the naming seems to work for people. So the Big Book of the Soul is a pretty hefty rewrite of the original Book of the Soul, because again, I'd come across a lot more research, and I got, to be quite plain about it, there was quite a few things I got wrong in the original book, and I wanted to get them right, because the Big Book of the Soul is the real source book for rational spirituality, so it's important that it stays dynamic and updated as I learn more things. So that was really the thinking behind those two, and then a good friend of mine rightly said, when I rewrote the Big Book of the Soul, all of the information about my concept of the holographic soul are in there in the last chapter of it, but very good friend of mine rightly said to me, well, really, this concept of the holographic soul is getting a little bit lost in your other bigger books. Perhaps you should just write a book that just concentrates on that. And I could see the logic of that.